All right, so an introduction, jumping pen, an introduction to pure monopoly. And again, remember they kind of gave you these terms pure to remind you that these are at the opposite ends of the spectrum, right? Industry type is along some spectrum where I don't remember exactly what, I think I put monopoly over here. And then I put oligopoly close. And then over here is monopolistic competition. And again, they say pure monopoly to help you highlight the fact that it's on the absolute end. And then over here, we've got pure competition. Also known as perfect competition, right? So you'll see it abbreviated as PC oftentimes. So an introduction to our pure monopoly. So our definition of our pure monopoly is when there exists a single firm that is the sole producer of a good or service for which there are no close substitutes. So several definitions to characterize a pure monopoly, several characterizations rather, characteristics, third time's the charm. So a single seller, and what does that mean that there's a single seller? That means that the firm is synonymous with the industry. So this is going to be important when we are working on our graphs, right? So before, the industry had a downward sloping demand curve and the firm had a flat demand curve because they were price takers, but now the firm is the industry, so these are going to be price makers, but we'll get to that in just a second here. So what's our second characteristic that we have, right? So we already talked about it, but it's worth restating. There are no close substitutes. Very important. So as a result of all of this, we end up having the monopoly firm being a price maker. What does this mean? They have considerable control over the price. And why do they have control over the price? Because they can control the quantity supplied. And lastly, a pretty important one, there are significant barriers to entry and exit, or entry into the industry by other firms is locked. So you cannot play in my industry if I am the sole monopolist there. So there's a lot of products where the producers are going to have some monopoly power. But not complete monopoly power. We call these near monopolies for obvious reasons. Let's go through some examples of our pure and near monopolies. So our first one that we have, we talked about the other day, public utilities. So your gas, your electric, your water, your cable TV, any kind of local telephone, right? Not that we would ever pick up a landline, right? But these are all pure monopolies. Then we've got some examples of near monopolies. So near monopolies would be places that, you know, can send money really fast, right? So they're called first data resources, but I mean, a lot of us probably just know them as Western Union. We've got Frisbees. They are exclusively sold by Whammo. Well, almost exclusively. And then we've got De Beers Diamonds, and it's a diamond syndicate that artificially jacks up the price of these things by essentially putting a bunch of diamonds and stuff in a vault. They're also the people that spread the rumor that in order to get engaged, you have to, what is it, 3 months of your salary or 6 months of your salary? I can't exactly remember, but like there's some like rule of thumb about like how much the engagement ring should be, and that was like a marketing tactic that De Beers pioneered and spread. So these are some examples of near monopolies. We've got professional sports leagues, right? Those are monopolies. Or rather, they grant team monopolies to cities. You know, if Denver wanted to have another NFL team, it's not going to happen, right? If Rapid City wanted to have an NFL team, it'd be a really hard lift for them, right? In order to, and there would have to be like some sort of eccentric billionaire living up there that's like, I'll sponsor the stadium, and then, you know, yeah, essentially would become part of the actual sports team, but he would own the sports team, but he would get the exclusive rights to that. So monopolies can be geographic in nature, right? So a small town, right, may only have one airline or airport, just like ours. When I first started working here, my neighbor, Jim, asked me, he was like, why are there so many banks here? Why are there like a million, like there's not that many people here, and there's not, you know what I mean? Like why are there like 10 banks here? And I was like, I honestly don't have a clue. You would think that there'd be less, right? You know, so it's yeah, so some towns I guess only have one, but you know, because of I guess all of the ranching activity and things like that, right? There's a lot of lending and stuff going on, I guess. I don't know. Something I should look into. So monopolies, we know they're characterized by these barriers to entry, right? So these barriers to entry, what do they do? They limit competition. So the main barrier to entry that we are used to thinking about is economies of scale. Right? We'll think about mass production, right? So this is when you can only achieve the lowest unit cost if you are the only large firm. So a very large firm with a very large market share is going to be most efficient. And when we say market share, we mean the share of sales of that particular product that are sold by that exact firm. So if we got a huge firm and they sell 80% of the market's stuff, right, then it's going to be very efficient. And by very efficient, we mean it's going to have the lowest unit costs. And so as a result of this, right, it becomes very difficult to impossible for startup industries, for new companies. They just can't grow, they can't get to that point where they're actually able to compete with these very large firms that have much lower average costs. Now, there may be legal reasons, right? So it's not always because of economies of scale. There may be some legal barriers, right? So when there are legal barriers, we can put them into groups of patents, licenses, and trade secrets. I'm not going to write trade secrets here because the book doesn't write it, but it's important for us to remember that some things like Coca-Cola's formulation, it's not patented, it's not licensed, right? But it's part of their monopoly. It's their trade secret as part of their monopoly. If they were to patent it, then the formula would be public, right? So it's been a trade secret for over 100 years now. So that's one of the barriers to entry, right? But the book only really talks about these two. So patents, what's a patent? So a patent grants the inventor the exclusive right to purchase, produce, or lease. Exclusive right to purchase or license, not lease, a product. And this is for 20 years. And so, big one that we see with this has to do with medications, right? They'll hold the patent for so long, and then once the patent goes, then all of a sudden there's generic ones available, right? That are produced by people who can afford to charge way less because they didn't spend the money on the research and development, right? Oftentimes it's like millions and millions of dollars, and it's like 1 out of 100 of the drugs actually passes and does the actual stuff, right? Passes all the tests, so on and so forth. So the other form that we have are licenses. So think about radio and TV stations, right? I can't just start my own radio station and start broadcasting from my house, right? These are examples of the government granting licenses where only one or a few firms can offer the service. So those are our legal barriers to entry. We've also got just, if you can just corner the market on it, right? So ownership or control of essential resources. That's another barrier to entry, right? So we've got 2 examples of this, or 3 rather. We've got the International Nickel Co. of Canada, which I guess is called INCO these days. they controlled about 90% of the world's nickel, not the nickels, right, but nickel metal reserves. And like we talked about a little bit before, right, we've got De Beers of South Africa controls most of the world's diamond supplies. And then we've got professional sports leagues. Controlling both player contracts and leases on major city stadiums. So last but certainly not least, these monopolists may use pricing or other strategic barriers. And so what are these other strategic barriers? We've got selective price cutting and selective advertising. A couple of examples here to clarify things. So the first example we have is Dentsply, which hopefully none of us have heard of because they're a manufacturer of false teeth. Sorry, I didn't mean to false teeth shame there. Which controlled about 70% of the market back in the day. 1999, the U.S. Justice Department, who is a part of overseeing, the regulations that we have on monopolies, which we'll get to in a bit, they accuse them of illegally preventing distributors for carrying competing brands. And the other one, more famous one, is the Microsoft antitrust lawsuit, right, where Microsoft charged higher prices to computer manufacturers, right, so to Dell and to HP and all these other places, right, for Windows operating system to manufacturers that featured this relic that you guys probably don't even know, Netscape Navigator. It was like kind of like the Mozilla Firefox of the day, instead of Microsoft's Internet Explorer. So you can't charge different prices even if there's some weird deal going on, right, where I'm sure these manufacturers are being paid by Netscape in order to put the Netscape Navigator on the computer, but that's legal. But for Microsoft to say, I'm going to charge you more money, well, and I don't think they were upfront about it too, right? So they were like, well, actually, maybe they were, because they wanted their Internet Explorer on the computer. So they were like, I'll give you a cheaper price if you put Internet Explorer on there. And that was deemed illegal. So U.S. courts ruled this action, a sick bird. So I always like to zoom out so much. It's like just your guys' class too. Like all this, I think I'm writing within the lines, and then all of a sudden, I'm like super zoomed out. So 3, monopoly demand is the industry or market demand. And so therefore, the monopoly demand is what? Downward sloping. So let's go ahead and jump into figure 8-1. So figure 8-1, we've got some revenue data, right? We've got some output, and let's just go ahead and reproduce just a little bit real quick. So quantity, price, and then total revenue. So the difference that's happening here is that in our last example, right, the price was, $4 or $11 or $10, whatever it was, right? Didn't matter how many they sold, didn't matter how many DVDs Walmart sells. When you go into Walmart, they make $10 per DVD, right? But now we're talking about a monopolist. So we're talking about, somebody who is selling the only thing, and you want that thing. And so they're going to essentially prey upon the fact that they know that there are some consumers that are willing to pay much more than most consumers, right? So they know that if there's 1 unit of output, they can charge $162 and they can sell that. But then as soon as they increase it to 2 units of output, they have to lower the price to $152 in order to sell that, because that's the willingness to pay for that second unit of whatever that thing is. And so essentially this is just decreasing by 10 all the way down to 10 and then 72, okay? And so this ends up giving us a demand curve and this is my crude approximation of figure 8.1 on page 196. And so we've got price over here, we've got quantity over here. We're going to have a demand curve that is, again, downward sloping, starts at, let's see if this is, let's make this 100, let's make this 200. So it starts at like 172 or whatever, right, around there. And it's just going to go downward sloping all the way into the axis. And this doesn't really matter. I'm just trying to teach you guys the intuition here. So this is our demand curve for, Great Plains communication, right? And so since our demand curve is downward sloping, then what's our extra marginal revenue? So before, our extra marginal revenue was just 11, right? It was just whatever the price of the good was. So now our marginal revenue is going to be a line that has twice the slope. So if this goes through 18, this is going to go through near 9. Oop. So it's got twice the slope. So if this had a slope of m equals 1, then this has a slope of m equals 2. It's got 2 fall for each rise. And this is my marginal revenue. This is the extra revenue that I can hope to get by selling one more product. So what happens at a certain point, right? At a certain point, selling that 10th product ends up resulting in a decrease in my total revenue. So let's go ahead just real quick. So if we go 9, it was 82. So 9 times 82 is going to give us a total revenue of 738. 10 times 72 is going to give us total revenue of 720. So this, right, this was a decrease of negative 18. So that's why when we're going, 9 and 10, we're going to have negative numbers here, because it's a negative marginal revenue. Oh, sorry. I thought you were not going to get in. No, you're good, man. I'll close it. You're good. I was like, I swear I heard something. I'm not crazy. All right. So when it becomes negative, so when marginal revenue becomes negative, that's when our total revenue is going to fall. All right? And so remember, the monopolist is the price maker. They control the output and price, but this doesn't mean that they're free from market influences. So the combination of output and price is going to depend on this demand curve. So we're going to use the same cost data that we used before. So this is section 4. So we're using the same, so figure 8.2. It restates the data of figure 6.3, which we've already foxed around with, right? So we're good. So it's going to be the same kind of stuff, right? We can just go ahead and we can just quickly, maybe. Cool with it. All right, so here is, we have overlaid the monopolist demand and marginal revenue curve onto our standard set of average total cost and marginal cost curve. Forget about the variable cost, forget about the fixed cost for the moment. So we're confused at first because we're like, oh, there's crossing and many, it's like the demand is crossing the average total cost curve twice, and then this marginal revenue curve, it's kind of like a wishbone coming out of it, right? Like they should be coming from exactly the same spot, but the marginal revenue has twice the slope. But at the end of the day, we're still going to hold true that our Q star, the Q that maximizes profits, right, is going to be where the marginal revenue is equal to the marginal cost, okay? So there's a reason why I keep accentuating the fact that it's the Q star that maximizes the profits, all right? So before, we're used to finding where the marginal revenue equals the marginal cost, dropping to the Q star, and then going out to, we don't actually care. This price, this whatever, it doesn't matter at all. So that's why you should be dropping an anchor right there and not caring about the price where they meet. Because why? Well, I'm the monopolist. Here's what I can charge. When the quantity is this is actually the amount that I get to charge, right? I'm not going to charge the marginal revenue that I'm getting. I'm not some perfect competition chump, right? I'm a monopolist, so I can get this extra price for it because that is the willingness to pay of the consumers when there are that many products, right? So in our example here, it's going to be 5. And we are going to find that that gives us a price of 122. We end up with an average total cost when the quantity is 5 of 94. And so just as before, right, we know that this full circle here, we know that this full thing is our total revenue, right? It's our price times our quantity. And then we also know that this thing right here is our total cost because it's our what? Our average total cost times quantity, which equals total cost just by definition. So when we want to get the profit, we are subtracting that lower rectangle from the larger rectangle in order to get the profit rectangle, not square, rectangle, which is going to be in this area right here. Does it not, can you guys not see very well when I highlight? I'm going to stop highlighting. I'll just do like a gray outline. So this is our profit square. And so this economic profit, right, we can actually calculate this because we have the quantity and we have the price and the average total cost, right? So the area of this rectangle, I did it, is 5 times the price minus the average total cost at 5. So it's going to give us a profit of $140. And so this is the intuition. So the book has, you know, a detailed account here, right, where you can actually take a look and see in the table that's associated with figure 8.2 that this is the price that's going to give us the most profit, right? Because we could go ahead and we could maybe sell 4 units, right? What would happen if we were to sell 4 units? Selling 4 units would mean that our average cost is higher, right? So 4 units, our average total cost would be 100. And at 4 units, our demand, right, we would get a better price for it because we're decreasing the amount of things in the market, right? And so we don't need to cater to as many customers and their willingness to pay. So now we're going to charge $10 more. We're going to charge $132. So we can tell already, right, that, you know, 4 times 132 minus 100, 4 times 32 is going to give me what? 128. So it's going to be less than my 140. And so you can do the same kind of exercise again using the table, using the numbers in the book. You can do the same exercise to see that the profit goes down to 122 when we do a similar thing if we were to produce 6. And so it's our profit maximizing outcome. We're going to get the most profit. This is the maximum amount of profit that we can get, 140, and it's by setting the marginal revenue equal to the marginal cost, dropping an anchor, right? Dropping some anchor here, ignoring this. It doesn't matter. That's the number one thing that a lot of students will say. They'll be like, oh, this is how much they charge. No, it's not how much they charge. They're always going to go up to the demand curve and charge that maximum price that they can charge. Does that make sense? Okay. It's not unit profits that they're after, it's total profits. All right, so let's evaluate the effects of this kind of stuff. And so when we look at the economic effects, when we evaluate this, right, we have to consider price, output, and the efficiency of resource allocation. So what do we mean by this? Well, we know that monopolists will sell smaller output, charge a higher price than would some perfectly competitive firm in the same market, right? So assuming the same costs, right? Ceteris paribus. So the monopolist price, so what happens in perfect competition? Well, eventually there's a tendency for that price to be where the marginal cost meets the average total cost curve, right? Because there's free entry and exit of the firms, and that's going to shift the supply curve, right? And so in perfect competition, we've got the price equaling the marginal cost, right? But in monopoly, will exceed the marginal cost. And they're gonna charge a price that consumers are going to pay And so how do they find that P max? They go ahead and they look at the schedule of the willingness to pay of the consumers, also known as the demand curve. So efficiency of resource allocation, right? So this is another term for what are allocative efficiency. So allocative efficiency is never achieved in monopolies. Why? Because price, what it's worth to consumers, is above the marginal cost. And the marginal cost is the opportunity cost of producing that product. So what other product could we have made if we had taken those resources that produced that product and produced a different product? So ideally, output should expand to a level where the price equals the marginal revenue. That's way too many equal signs. Beep, beep, beep. Which equals the marginal cost. But as we know, this situation only occurs in perfect competition because the demand is equal to the marginal revenue, which is equal to the price in perfect competition. So allocative efficiency, efficiency as it relates to societal and how much they value things, is not going to be achieved when we're in a monopoly situation. And well, if we don't have that efficiency, do we have the other one? Do we have productive efficiency at least? No. And remember, where is the ATC at its minimum? It's always where the marginal cost intersects the average total cost. Q, where that happens. So as a result of all this jazz, we end up getting an income distribution that's more unequal than if under a perfectly competitive scenario. So the effect of this monopoly power transfers income from consumers to the business owners. If it was a perfectly competitive situation, there'd be more produced, it'd be at a cheaper price. So this redistribution of income is going to favor higher income businesses unless the buyers of the monopoly products are wealthier than the monopoly owners. So consumers lose, monopolists gain. All right, let's look at some cost complementaries. So cost complementaries may lead to some other conclusions that we have. So what are those? Well, these economies of scale that we talked about may result in 1 to 2 firms operating in an industry that is experiencing lower ATC, lower average total costs, right, than many perfectly competitive firms. So these economies of scale could be because there's a large capital cost and it's spread over a large number of units, large number of years, or it could be a greater specialization of inputs. So a couple of things are going to promote and foster economies of scale. The first one for us to talk about is the notion of simultaneous consumption. And so this is a product's ability to satisfy or satiate a large number of consumers at the same time. One of my favorite podcasts, they do these, live shows, right? And they used to sell live shows that were actually live, right, before everything happened. But now they sell live shows and they're on the internet, right? And so they can sell as many as they want, right? We all can consume it at the exact same time. They can have, I think there was like 4,000 people on the last one or whatever, right? It was actually pretty cool. They had this like quiz that was part of it, and then you could take the quiz at home, and if you got the highest score or the second highest score, they sent you some swag. It was like interactive. I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. So this stuff, right, this is going to promote economies of scale. That's why a lot of, internet.com businesses and things like that, right, they can get a lot of economies of scale because it's on rival, right? The consumption of that good by one person doesn't preclude the consumption of that good by another person, right? It can be copied an infinite amount of times. Secondly, network effects. This is a big one. So this is the fact that the value or the economies of scale that there are increases in the value of a product to each user as the number of users increases. So this is also going to foster economies of scale. And so we're used to this in our everyday life, right? That's why we're all stuck on Facebook, despite their, not great practices or whatever the case may be, or selling our information or whatever, right? But it's like everybody's on there. So what are you going to do? Go to Google Plus or go back to MySpace or something, right? You know what I mean? Like, so it's like the value of Facebook increases the more that there are the users, right? That's like their whole business model. We can also think about fax machines back in the day, right? You guys know what fax machines are, right? You can send stuff through the telephone with beeps and everything, right? But you have to have a particular machine to do it, and it was expensive to get those. And a lot of people didn't want to adopt it because they were like, I don't even know anybody with a fax machine. Why would I get a fax machine? I think there was even a Seinfeld episode about it, right? So until everybody got a fax machine, then it was now it was more valuable to you individually to get a fax machine because you could fax with more people, right? These days, if you ever need to fax, you can always there's like online things where you can fax. But I'm always like curious about those. I'm like, what happens to my thing that I faxed? Like, is it secure? You know what I mean? Like the free fax online thing, like. Because usually when you're faxing something too, it's like a document that like has your identifying information on it or something, right? So don't do that. Actually, just go into like a bank or something and be like, I need to fax. I need to get this notarized and I need to fax. A big problem within monopolies is this notion of rent-seeking behavior. So this often occurs as monopolies seek to acquire, that's got a C in it, or maintain government granted privileges, monopoly privileges. So this rent seeking, right, it may be very costly. But it also might be necessary. So this takes the form of lobbying, legal fees, public relations advertising, right? And all of these, do these actually produce anything? Do these actually increase the well-being of anybody? No, right? These are all inefficient practices. So this is a big problem, the regulatory capture, the rent seeking that might happen. You know, they end up being very large supporters of the politicians that are sitting on the regulatory boards that are going to be deciding whether or not they get their contract renewed, right? So that ends up being very difficult. We've got some technological progress, so it's not all bad. There is some technological progress that results from monopolistic industries, but it's not all of them. So technological progress, oh sorry, 3. And dynamic efficiency. The fact that, you know, through those economies of scale, you'll be able to get lower average total cost curves than a similar perfectly competitive industry. These may occur in some monopolistic industries, but not in others. So some monopolies, you know, show little to no interest in technological progress, and they're just happy to keep their rents. On the other hand, other monopolies will spend a ton of money on research so they can get lower costs, right? They can also maintain their barriers to entry against new firms by developing new patents, new trade secrets, new licenses, so on and so forth. However, what we've seen is that major technological breakthroughs, right? So the big one is Uber, right? And it's actually pretty amazing, the fact that you know, back in the day, the CEO of Uber, he like publicly said, like, we're more of a lobbying company than we are a company that sells rides, because what they were doing is they were illegally undercutting the taxi medallion system, right? Like, these people would like save up their whole lives in order to get these taxi medallions, and there was only a limited supply of them. It was this government granted privilege to have a taxi medallion, and then Uber came in and was like, oh, we're just gonna like monetize hitchhiking and displace the taxi industry completely. And so major technological breakthroughs, and so that happened because of the smartphone industry, right? You didn't need a dispatcher. You didn't need this central company that knew wherever, you know what I mean? Like, a computer could do that, right? A computer could optimize that. So major technological breakthroughs can crash my computer. Can and do displace existing monopolies. And what is this called when they do it? It's called creative destruction. Come on, buddy. It's always like around the 50-minute recording mark. It's like, I can't, it's too much. I don't have that much RAM. All right, let's talk a little bit about price discrimination, and we'll call it there, and we'll pick up with antitrust policy and stuff like that, because that's super dry. So we'll pick up with that on Tuesday, right, in our last week of class. So I will also go through and edit through. I might have already, but I'll go and prune as much as I can the remainder of the quizzes and stuff like that, right? So if somebody's already like done chapter 10 and 11, then I can't really like take it away, right? But if nobody's done it, then I'm just going to take it away. Don't worry about doing it. We'll just do assignments up to chapter 8 to chapter 9. All right. So price discrimination. So price discrimination, this is this notion, discrimination. This is the notion that you can sell a given product at more than one price, and the price differences are not based on cost differences. So if you've ever, had those single serving conversations when you're on planes, right? And you sit next to somebody and you end up talking about stuff, right? Something you probably don't want to ask is, how much did you pay for this ticket? Because odds are it's not the same as what you paid, right? So there's so much discrimination that happens in the airline industry, right? Not only is there time discrimination, so if you guys have you ever tried to like book a last minute flight somewhere, it's crazy expensive, right? The reason for that is because they know they have you. They know that either you really need to get that place, right? There's like a funeral or something, or somebody's like in the hospital, right? So you're willing to pay 3 times the normal cost of it. Or you're a business traveler and you don't give a shit how much it costs, right? It's like your company's paying for it. And so they charge the high price for that. Now, they also have been doing this stuff where, every site that you go to leaves an artifact on your computer in the form of a cookie, right? And the other sites that you go to can read the cookies that you've been to, right? And so essentially American Airlines and Delta and all these places, they read those cookies and they build this kind of profile on you. So if you've been going to like Louis Vuitton and buying high-end purses and stuff, you're going to get a higher airline price than the person who is, going to the Safeway coupon site all the time, or whatever the case may be, right? And so you can use certain browsers, like there's this browser called Firefox Focus, which as soon as you close it, it just deletes all of your cookies and all that other kind of stuff, right? You can check that you request that sites do not track you, but they can still track you. The best thing to do if you really don't want to have any kind of discrimination about this stuff is to get a VPN, honestly, and to just start, tunneling your internet, and that way there's no way that anybody can track or build these profiles on you and charge you more than other people. And so there's other ways that we price discriminate, right? So when we go to the movie theaters, we get a cheaper rate than somebody that's not a student. And a senior gets a cheaper rate than us because seniors are on more limited income. And so they provide them this incentive for them to go to the movies by giving them this cheaper rate. So what are the conditions needed for a successful price discrimination? Now that we know what I'm talking about. So the first is that we need monopoly power. to control output, but really that's just so that I can control 9, to control price. I'm not dyslexic, you're dyslexic. The firm has to have some ability to segregate, I know, loaded word, right? But separate, I should probably say, the market. Dividing buyers into separate classes with different willingness to pay. Usually based on different elasticities of demand. And then the last thing that happens, and it's so funny because until I started teaching this, I was like, oh man, that is like crazy that you can't resell your airline tickets, right? Like you can resell concert tickets, but you can't resell airline tickets. That's because that's the way to have a successful price discrimination. Buyers must be unable to resell the original good or service. And so we got a bunch of examples. Airlines charge higher fares for executive travelers because they have more inelastic demand. They got to get there, right? Compared to vacation travelers, you could put off the vacation for another month or something. Electrical utilities segment their markets by heating and lighting, and they've also been in different places. Like when I was in Fort Collins, they started doing peak pricing. So they were trying to decrease the amount of energy that people were using specifically during like 4:30 to 8:30, right? Which is when we use most of our electricity, when we get home and we're cooking dinner and all this other kind of stuff, right? And so they made it like triple the pricing of normal electricity as a way to disincentivize you from doing that. It was like an environmental kind of thing, I guess. Golf courses charge different times based, different fees based on time, based on age, right? Discount coupons, right? So, I still use the Safeway coupon app, right? I still use the McDonald's app to get free stuff. And that's all ways for them to discriminate, right? I'm the type of consumer that, I'm a more price sensitive consumer. So if there's no like free McChicken or whatever, like I'm not going to go to McDonald's that day. And then there's some examples of international firms that are selling at different prices to consumers in different countries, but we don't really need to get into all that. All right, so we'll pick up here with the graphical analysis. So we'll pick up with figure 8.4. I'll do attendance real quick with everybody, and then we'll get going. I've got a sick kid at home, so.